There is a country right now that holds a power no military can match, no economy can buy, and no treaty has ever formally recognized. And the most unsettling part, every major government on Earth knows about it. They've known for decades, and they have all quietly, collectively, decided never to say it out loud. This isn't a conspiracy. There's no shadowy organization running the show. What exists instead is something far stranger, an unspoken agreement between nations that don't agree on anything else. An arrangement held together not by trust, not by law, but by one shared emotion, fear. By the end of this video, you're going to understand something about how the world actually operates that most people never stop to consider. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Let's start with something you've probably heard before. The Amazon rainforest is the lungs of the earth. You learned it in school, you've seen it on documentaries. Environmental campaigns have been built around it for 50 years. It's one of those facts that feels so established, so settled, that questioning it almost seems irresponsible. But here's the problem. That phrase, lungs of the earth, is not accurate. And the people who popularized it in the 1970s knew it wasn't fully accurate when they said it. It was a simplification, a useful piece of messaging designed to make a complicated system feel urgent and legible to the general public. The metaphor worked. It spread everywhere. And in spreading, it replaced a much more unsettling truth with something more comfortable. Because the real picture isn't cleaner than the metaphor. It's messier, and in some ways, it's significantly more frightening. Here's what the science actually shows. A mature, old-growth rainforest in equilibrium produces and consumes oxygen in roughly equal amounts over time. The trees release oxygen during photosynthesis and absorb it during respiration. The vast quantities of decomposing organic matter on the forest floor consume enormous amounts. The net oxygen contribution of old-growth Amazon forest to the global atmosphere approaches balance. It is nowhere near the planetary oxygen factory, the popular phrase suggests. Younger forest patches and riverine zones do contribute positively, so the Amazon as a whole is not oxygen neutral. So, does that mean it doesn't matter? That's exactly the wrong conclusion. What it means is that the lungs metaphor was pointing at the wrong thing entirely. The Amazon isn't primarily critical because of the oxygen percentage in the air you breathe. It's critical because of what it holds, what it regulates, and what it prevents. The Amazon basin contains approximately 10% of all species on Earth. It cycles water on a scale that controls rainfall patterns across an entire continent. It stores an estimated 150 to 200 billion tons of carbon. Carbon that, if released, would drive atmospheric change faster than any industrial output humanity has ever produced. It generates its own weather systems. It creates what scientists call flying rivers, invisible aerial streams of moisture that travel thousands of kilometers. These rivers determine whether cities like São Paulo, Bogotá, and large parts of interior South America receive rain or face drought. When you understand that, the stakes change completely. This isn't about oxygen percentages. This is about a single geographic region that functions as a climate and water regulator for an entire hemisphere. A region whose disruption would trigger cascading failures in agricultural systems, rainfall patterns, and weather stability across dozens of countries simultaneously. And all of that sits inside the sovereign borders of one nation, Brazil. Think about what that actually means. Every government in the developed world depends, in a very literal sense, on decisions made in Brasilia, on the priorities of whoever happens to be sitting in the presidential palace, on the domestic political pressures of a country of 215 million people with their own economic needs and their own competing interests. The most consequential environmental lever on the planet is controlled by a democracy with its own politics. and democracies change direction. This is where the history gets interesting. And this is where you start to see the shape of something that has been operating in the background of international relations for at least 4 decades. If you go back to the late 1980s, something shifted in how wealthy nations talked about the Amazon. Before that point, deforestation in Brazil was treated primarily as a regional issue. Unfortunate perhaps, but ultimately an internal matter. After that point, the tone changed dramatically. The language of international concern intensified. Environmental organizations funded from Europe and North America began operating inside Brazil at unprecedented scale. The World Bank attached conditions to loans. Diplomatic pressure arrived through channels that had nothing to do with traditional foreign policy. Brazil noticed, and Brazil was not pleased. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Brazilian officials and academics pushed back with a consistent argument. International pressure over the Amazon looked, from where they were sitting, less like genuine environmental concern and more like a new form of economic imperialism. The reasoning was straightforward. European nations had cleared the majority of their own forests centuries earlier to build their agricultural economies. The United States had done the same. Now, having industrialized on the back of their own environmental transformation, wealthy countries were telling Brazil it could not do what they had already done. They were, in effect, trying to pull up the ladder behind them. This argument had real political force inside Brazil. It wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. And both things were true simultaneously. There was genuine scientific alarm about the Amazon, and there was also, without question, a geopolitical calculation running underneath it. Because here is what the wealthy nations understood, even if they never said it plainly. You cannot invade Brazil to protect the Amazon. You cannot sanction a country of that size without destroying trade relationships you depend on. You cannot write a treaty that strips a sovereign nation of the right to manage its own territory. So what do you do when you need something you cannot demand, cannot buy outright, and cannot take by force? You construct an arrangement, informal, deniable, built from incentives and pressures and quiet understandings, rather than signed documents. You create a situation where Brazil has reasons to cooperate that feel, from the inside, like sovereign choices. This is the unwritten deal, and it has been renegotiated, broken, partially restored, and renegotiated again across every Brazilian administration since the 1980s. If you want to understand how fragile it is, you need to look at 3 moments when it came closest to collapse. The first fracture point came in the early 2000s. Brazil was expanding agricultural frontiers at a pace that alarmed international observers. Soy cultivation was driving deforestation into areas that had been considered stable. Satellite data showed canopy loss accelerating year over year. The informal pressure mechanisms that had worked through the 1990s were visibly failing. What happened next is instructive. Rather than confrontation, what emerged was the Amazon Fund, a financial mechanism through which Norway and Germany began paying Brazil directly for measurable reductions in deforestation. Not as aid, not as charity, framed explicitly as payment for an environmental service that the rest of the world was receiving without compensating Brazil for it. It was an extraordinary admission. By paying, Norway and Germany were implicitly acknowledging what Brazil had been arguing for years, that maintaining the Amazon intact carried real economic costs that Brazilians were absorbing on behalf of the entire planet. Deforestation rates dropped substantially over the following decade. The mechanism worked, and the fact that it worked told you something important. The arrangement runs on Brazil's continuous calculation that cooperation pays better than the alternative. The moment that calculation changes, the deal changes with it. The second fracture point was more visible. When Jair Bolsonaro took office in January 2019, he was explicit in a way no Brazilian president had been before. He questioned the legitimacy of international environmental oversight. He reduced the budgets and authority of enforcement agencies. He signaled to agricultural and mining interests that restrictions on Amazon development would be eased. What followed was the steepest rise in deforestation Brazil had recorded in over a decade. Germany moved first on the Amazon Fund, citing changes in Brazil's methodology for measuring deforestation, a technical trigger, but one that reflected a broader political judgment. Norway followed, suspending its contributions as the numbers continued to worsen. The European Union intensified discussions around environmental conditions attached to the long-running trade agreement with the Mercosur bloc, negotiations that had already stretched across 2 decades. Major European retailers began reviewing sourcing requirements for Brazilian agricultural products. None of these responses were formally coordinated. Each was technically a private or bilateral decision. But they arrived from enough directions simultaneously to function as a coordinated squeeze. This is what enforcement of the unwritten deal actually looks like. Not a treaty violation procedure, not a military response. A convergence of economic pressure applied through trade relationships, financial flows and supply chains, all pointing the same direction at the same time. Bolsonaro did not reverse course, but his successors have calculated differently, and that calculation is the entire mechanism. The third fracture point is still developing, and it involves a variable the previous 2 did not: China. For the first 4 decades of this arrangement, the primary external pressure on Brazil came from Europe and North America. China operates by different logic. China is now Brazil's largest trading partner by a margin that grows every year. China buys Brazilian soy, iron ore, and beef. China does not attach environmental conditions to those purchases. China does not suspend payments when deforestation rates rise. What this creates practically is an exit from the informal arrangement that did not meaningfully exist before. If European and North American pressure becomes too costly domestically, Brazilian exports can increasingly route through relationships that carry no environmental strings. The leverage that held the unwritten deal together depends on Brazil having no better offer. China is, at minimum, an alternative offer. And alternatives change negotiations. This is why analysts who study this carefully are more concerned now than they were 10 years ago. Not solely because deforestation rates remain high, though they do, but because the structural architecture that constrained the worst outcomes is weaker than it has been at any previous point. Here is where things actually stand. The Brazilian Amazon has lost somewhere between 17 and 20% of its original forest cover. Scientists who study non-linear tipping points in the system have placed that threshold in the range of 20 to 25% of forest loss. More recent work, including studies published in Nature in 2022, suggests parts of the eastern Amazon are already showing signs of transitioning toward a drier, savanna-like state. The tipping point may not be a single uniform threshold, but a patchwork of regional collapses that accumulate into a systemic one. The scientific consensus is not that the situation is under control. The consensus is that the margin is uncomfortably narrow and the dynamics are not fully understood. Most races have a winner. This one has a loser. And the loser is whoever is alive when the feedback loops outrun the diplomacy. When that threshold is crossed, the mechanism that everyone has been quietly managing around becomes a crisis that cannot be managed quietly. The flying rivers weaken. Agricultural systems that depend on Amazon-regulated rainfall begin to fail across a region that feeds hundreds of millions of people. The carbon stored across centuries of forest growth enters the atmosphere over decades rather than millennia. At that point, the unwritten deal stops mattering, because what the deal was always about has already arrived, and there is no diplomatic channel for reversing a biological threshold crossed at continental scale. There is no emergency summit that restores a forest. which means the quiet agreement that has shaped international environmental relations for 4 decades is, at its core, a race. A race between the slow accumulation of financial incentives, trade conditions, and diplomatic pressure on one side, and the faster accumulation of domestic political calculation, expanding agricultural frontiers, and newly available trade alternatives on the other. What makes this genuinely different from most geopolitical situations is that most of them can be renegotiated at any point. A trade dispute resolves, a military standoff de-escalates. Relationships that deteriorate can be repaired over years or decades. What cannot be renegotiated is a biological system that has crossed its threshold. The Amazon does not have a diplomatic back channel. It does not respond to summits. Once the internal feedback loops take over, the question of who said what to whom in Brasilia becomes irrelevant. This is what no government will say plainly, and what the unwritten deal requires everyone to keep at the level of abstraction. They are managing a risk they cannot fully control, using tools they know are imperfect, in a time window they cannot precisely define, against a deadline that does not negotiate. The silence around all of this is not ignorance. Every relevant government has access to the same scientific literature. The silence is a structural choice, made by people who understand the situation and have concluded that managing it quietly is preferable to confronting it honestly. Because the solutions, stated honestly, involve constraints on land use, trade relationships, and economic development that no democratic government has yet been willing to impose at the scale the science suggests is necessary. So the arrangement continues, informal, partially functional, more fragile than it has been at any previous point, and almost entirely absent from the conversations that most people have about climate, about geopolitics, about the future. The reason this matters to you, regardless of where you live, is not abstract. Weather patterns, food prices, water availability across the Western Hemisphere are downstream of decisions being made in a country most people couldn't place on a map a decade ago. The international system that is supposed to manage these risks is held together by incentive structures that are being disrupted faster than they can be replaced. And the governments who understand this have made a collective decision to keep the conversation at a level that prevents it from becoming the political crisis it actually is. That is what the unwritten deal is. Not a conspiracy, not a dramatic cover-up. Something more mundane and more troubling. A shared decision to maintain a workable fiction, because the alternative requires a kind of political honesty that the current system does not reliably produce. If this kind of video, grounded in actual mechanics rather than speculation, is what you come here for, subscribing is the most direct way to make sure you see the next one. And if something in this video shifted how you think about the Amazon or about how international arrangements actually work, drop it in the comments. That conversation is genuinely more interesting than most of what gets discussed about this topic. The next video applies the same lens to a different subject, a different region, a different unspoken arrangement between nations. A different thing that is hidden not because it's classified, but because saying it plainly would require everyone involved to stop pretending they don't know what they know. There are more of these than most people realize, and they tend to hide in exactly the same place, directly in front of us, dressed up as things we already think we understand.